So I'd like to welcome everybody to our Sci-Cafe webinar. This is the first virtual webinar we've had. We've had the Sci-Cafes around for several years. The intention there is to bring science that's being done in Apalachicola Bay to the forefront to people, so you can actually question the scientists that are doing the work in a more informal setting. In the past, we've had these talks in art galleries and restaurants and in breweries. And I forgot to introduce who I am. I'm Anita Grove with the Apalachicola National Estuarine Research Reserve. Helping me today is Kennedy Hansen and Josh Eaton. And we have a series that's going to go throughout the spring, which I'll share with you afterwards. Our program today will be about an hour in length, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. If you do have a question, please type it in the question bar, and we'll tell Carrie afterwards. We'll ask her those questions. Today, we're fortunate to have Carrie Jones with us, and she is an environmental supervisor with the Florida Department of Agriculture, Bureau of Aquaculture. Sorry, I've got a screen issue. And she has got a BA and a master's degree from the Coastal Carolina University in South Carolina. She's originally from Maryland, and she's going to tell us about the new water column aquaculture leases in the western section of the bay. So thank you, Carrie, and I will turn it over to you. If you'll just let me know when you want me to change slides, I'll change them for you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me, Anita, and thank you for that introduction. As she said, my name is Carrie Jones, and I am with the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, or I'll just probably call it FDACS from here going forward, a little bit shorter and easier to say. But I'm going to be talking to you today about shellfish aquaculture. I've been in Appalachia for about 12 years now, and with DACS for 9 years. But I like to show this picture here on the right. This is a picture of some triploid farmed oysters. These particular triploids have a really nice defined streak on their shell. Triploids, so trip meaning 3, they have 3 sets of chromosomes compared to the usual diploids, which have 2 sets. So with 3 sets, they are sterile and generally can grow faster than diploids since they aren't expending that energy to reproduce. Although farmers can grow diploids or triploids, many choose the triploids since they can get to market size faster. So next time you're at your favorite oyster bar, you can impress your friends, and if you happen to see a streak like this, you'll know that they are farmed oyster versus a wild. But not all triploids have a nice defined streak. So if you don't see one, it doesn't mean that it's wild, but if you do see one, you'll know that it is a farmed triploid oyster. And my contact information is over here. I'll also put it up at the end. You're welcome to, if you have any other questions that you think of later, shoot me an email or give me a phone call as well. So basically, this is just an overview of what I'm going to be talking to you about today. So basically just what is aquaculture, give you an industry overview, and then some aquaculture benefits, and then the process for obtaining a lease, a little history of Apalachicola Bay, and then how we manage the leases. So first and foremost, what is aquaculture? So some may just know it as fish farming, but it includes a lot of different aquatic organisms. You might know it mostly for products sold as food. So white shrimp, tilapia, pompano, all that. But actually our #1 producer is ornamentals. There's also a lot of different miscellaneous products such as zebrafish for medical and genetic work, alligator leather for clothing, boots and purses, algae paste for supplements and used in some cosmetics. And then also for our conservation and recreational fisheries, fish hatcheries actually helped develop commercial aquaculture techniques in the 50s and 60s, which helped stock game fish and imperiled species such as mussels and largemouth bass throughout the United States for recreational fishing and conservation. Next slide. So lots of different product types. We're going to be focusing on shellfish today, but I just kind of wanted to give you a big overview of the industry as a whole. So it includes a lot. Florida aquaculture has actually the greatest product diversity in the nation. And that includes everything from fish to crustaceans, shellfish, plants. Actually, seaweed is a multi-billion-dollar industry. We're currently trying to get permitted for that in Florida right now. And pretty exciting news, we just got approved our first experimental lease offshore of Sarasota. Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute is going to be experimenting and see what kind of native species we can grow here. So that's pretty exciting. We also have a couple of conservation mangrove farms in Florida as well. And then, of course, our reptiles. Next slide. And then with all those different product types, we have lots of different production systems. The ponds are our main system for fish. The upper left picture is a 1,000-acre catfish farm in the Mississippi Delta. And then we have our raceways, which are like river flow systems for salmon and trout. This is a North Georgia trout farm for recreational fishery. And then we have tanks recirculating indoor systems like for tilapia. And then our offshore cages, this is a long line system in the Gulf of Mexico for oysters. Next slide. So why do we need aquaculture? Aquaculture is rapidly growing to meet increasing global seafood demand, conserve wild fisheries, and feed a growing population. This graph on the right shows that the orange is wild caught and blue is aquaculture. So you can see from this graph, starting in 1950, that about 97% of the fish were caught wild from the ocean. We've still been harvesting around the same amount since 1980, but now with more people, that isn't enough. Aquaculture has fulfilled that gap and is now 52% of global production. The US Census Bureau predicts that the world's population will reach over 9 billion people by the year 2050. We would need 500 million metric tons of lean protein per year to provide the world's population their daily recommended amount of protein, which is about 100 million more than today. So needless to say, that number is a bit troubling. We already know that few places on the planet are actually capable of consuming the USDA recommended levels of protein. And if we want to feed the world, we have a long road ahead. Next slide. This map here on the left shows the aquaculture certificates per county. That red county is Levy, which is our big clam hotspot. And then the two orange counties over on the panhandle, the one on the tip obviously is Franklin County, and we're up to 66 aquaculture certificates. And that number is currently growing as we speak, which I'm going to talk a little bit about later. But also we just added 21 new parcels expanding their aquaculture use zone in Alligator Harbor, which is also part of Franklin County, bringing that up to 67 aquaculture farms in Alligator Harbor currently. And they're growing clams and oysters. And then the county above that is Wakulla, and they're up to the 50 to 100 producer mark, just growing oysters over there. Also on the right, you can see Florida produces the most amount of ornamentals in the nation. We produce 95% of freshwater ornamental fish industry for the entire nation. So if you're going up to Petco or PetSmart somewhere, anywhere in the United States, there's a good chance it came from Florida. Florida is also the 9th in the nation overall for the farm to gate value. We have about 1,000 aquaculture certificates and over 800 species in production. Like I said, that ornamentals is probably our biggest producer, but shellfish isn't too far behind at 17%. Next slide. So again, with that greatest product diversity in the nation, just wanted to show you a couple of species. We of course have our beautiful aquarium fish, our tangs, and our clowns. Next slide. And then of course we have our food fish, everything from pompano, tilapia, shrimp, and caviar from sturgeon. Next slide. And then our beloved shellfish, of course, our clams and our oysters. The top right is our pretty sunray Venus clams. They're actually really good too. Next slide. And then of course our alligators and turtles. Next slide. In our aquatic plants, a lot of water lilies and ornamental decorative pond plants. Next slide. So basically your big take home today is shellfish aquaculture is a key solution. It's an environmental and economic win-win. Shellfish farmers are coastal stewards. They have an economic incentive to protect the commons. Next slide. And every farm has multiple benefits. So again, that environmental win-win. They can help improve water quality by extracting nitrogen and phosphorus. And as filter feeders, bivalves can also improve clarity. 85% of the native oyster populations have been lost worldwide. So habitat provision is a huge benefit, along with refuge for fish populations and other species. And then it can also help reduce local climate change impacts by reducing carbon dioxide and increasing oxygen with seaweed, or through increased water clarity by shellfish. It can also promote seagrass growth and be a carbon sink. Next slide. Shellfish farms are like living water treatment plants. About 550 million gallons of seawater are filtered each day in Florida by aquacultured clams. And a 2.5 acre oyster farm can help mitigate the nitrogen pollution of 50 coastal inhabitants. So that's pretty cool too. Next slide. So there's two main types of shellfish leases. And the first one is for our clams, and that's a bottom culture. And they can only use the bottom 6 inches. But they usually grow these clams in nylon mesh bags. And then they also have a cover netting that they place on top and anchor down. Next slide. And then our second main type is water column culture. And these are for our oysters mainly. And they can grow them in a couple of different gear types. So we have our floating cages or bags on the top left. And then on the top right, we have a long line type system in which they're grown in baskets that you can clip onto the line. And then they have poles strung, the line strung through on the poles, and you can move the line up and down with the tide. You may also see some tumblers or like metal cylinders on the boats. They're used for sorting or, like I said, tumbling. Some farmers like to tumble their oysters. It can help knock off any new growth and then actually help manipulate the shape so they're more of a cup shape as opposed to being long and skinny. And then actually farmers can grow oysters to pretty much whatever size they want and actually market the desired market size is a 2.5 inch oyster, as that's what can fit on a cracker. Next slide. So as the Division of Aquaculture, we oversee the application, execution, and compliance of submerged land leases for aquaculture use. And that includes everything from assessing the proposed site or identifying any new areas, and then the actual lease permitting and annual farm certification. And we also have a best management practices program. And then we also go and conduct inspections and audits to ensure regulatory compliance. To date, Florida has 784 active leases covering 2,795 acres. Next slide. So this is just a flow chart breakdown of our leasing process. It's pretty streamlined. A lot of other states actually have used our process as well to emulate, to get theirs a little bit more streamlined. And once a site is selected and the applicant or someone has filled out an application, which you can also get on our website, they'll submit it and we'll review it. And then we will send it off to DEP for a title determination to make sure that there's no encumbrances. And then once that is complete, then I'll go out and assess the area. Basically, under the Army Corps permit that we work off of, it has to be bare bottom. There can't be any resources present, so no seagrasses, existing oyster habitat, or coral. And then once that's been completed, then we send it off for public noticing, like in the local papers, and then also local, state, and federal review. And if there's no objections, then we'll take it up to the Florida governor and cabinet. And then if that is approved, then it is the leaseholder or the applicant's responsibility to go get that area surveyed from a third party. And if it's a water column lease, we'll apply for a navigational permit from the U.S. Coast Guard. And then once all of those documents are together, we finalize the lease and execute. Next slide. So once a lease is executed, then we will go out and inspect them annually to enforce our marking requirements. All aquaculture use zones or individual parcels must be designated with a big, large corner marker, especially for the water column leases. They have to have this big, up here on the right, the big U.S. Coast Guard 3x3 yellow sign, as well as a lantern. And then the interior poles are usually designated by a small PVC pole. They both must contain corner direction and lease identification. And then we also conduct lease audits annually to ensure effective cultivation. They're required to plant at least 70,000 oysters per acre per year. Next slide. A shellfish aquaculture use zone is just an area with multiple predetermined lease parcels grouped into a single area, often containing dozens of parcels or leases. This is just an example. This map specifically shows all the AUZs around the state. You can see we have a lot grouped over in our Cedar Key area. We have the one over in Alligator Harbor and some more over in the south and over on the East Coast. They're beneficial for lots of different reasons for us and for the leaseholder, kind of a little bit of safety in numbers. Then we can also kind of just group everybody together so that way we're not having to deal with a whole lot of navigation, them being all scattered all about the bay, and they're all in kind of one good area. So yeah, next slide. This is a map of showing all of our shellfish harvesting areas in the state. You can see, and the red areas are showing the regional offices we have. So one in Panama City, Apalachicola, Cedar Key, Punta Gorda, and Palm Bay. And we have staff in those areas that are also going out regularly and taking water samples. As shellfish are filter feeders, we go out and we want to make sure that there's not any bad bacteria in the water, and we'll open and close the areas accordingly to make sure that you can go out and eat seafood and not get shellfish and not get sick, hopefully. And you can go on our website and click on each of these individual areas and see if the area is open or closed to harvest. Next slide. This is our website here at the top that I listed, but if you don't have anything to write it down with, you can also just go to our main page, which is fdacs.gov, and then you can click on divisions and offices, and then aquaculture, and it will bring you to our main page, and you can click on the status of the areas, and then we also have integrated this new interactive map that's pretty cool. You can go on and you can see the whole state, but you can also go and look and see where all of the leases are within the state, as well as regional areas or specific areas. I zoomed into Apalachicola here for us to take a look at, but you can also click on the individual shellfish harvesting area and see when it opens and closes, on what conditions, and when it's supposed to be open seasonally or not, and what kind of classification it is. So these two blue areas on the outer edges are approved classification status, and that means that their water quality is good pretty much all the time. We only close those areas on emergency conditions such as hurricanes or sewage spills and stuff like that. And then those green areas are our conditionally approved areas. So they're closed on certain conditions such as rainfall or river. And then we have the yellow and the red, which are restricted and prohibited areas, and no shellfish can be harvested from there at any time. The yellow dots are all of our shellfish water quality sampling stations. And like I said, we have staff in this area that go out and take samples from those regularly. And you can only put leases in an approved or conditionally approved status, as that's where we know that water quality is the best. Next slide. And so I mentioned earlier this greater than 85% of all oyster reefs on Earth are now gone. So it's not just an Apalachicola Bay problem, it's happening everywhere and for lots of different factors, including environmental and human stressors. So some of the water quality stressors can be anything from the salinity being too high or too low, high temperature, low dissolved oxygen. Incoming silt can bury a reef faster than it can grow, like from hurricanes or storms. What we've seen a lot in our bay is predation. With all of our droughts and high salinities, a lot of these predators have been coming in from the Gulf into the bay and really can decimate a reef pretty quickly. And then once that area is decimated, there's loss of spawning due to the low density. And in some areas, we also have oyster disease like Chesapeake Bay. Next slide. So this graph is showing the unfortunate decline of the Florida commercial oyster harvest from 1985 to 2019. I'm sure everyone has heard the statistic of, the 90% of Apalachicola oysters to Florida and 10% nationwide all came from Apalachicola. But you can see that the statewide numbers were also declining, have been in decline as well. The green bar being Apalachicola and the blue bar being statewide. And you can see 2019, the green Apalachicola bar is pretty much can barely see. But also the bay was closed for 9 months in 1985 following damaging hurricanes Elena and Kate. And then 2007 to 8, we had a pretty major drought, as well as then again in 2012 and through 2013. And then when NOAA came in and declared us a fisheries failure in 2013. Next slide. But oysters have been around for a really long time. Native Americans have lived in this region for thousands of years, and its modern history as a European settlement dating back to the early 1700s. Oysters were a main food source for the Native Americans, as evidenced by many of the shell middens. And the city was incorporated as West Point in 1827, and it was renamed Apalachicola, which is Native American word locally interpreted as land of the friendly people. Then it served as a port in 19th century, with cotton being the main export in 1830s and 40s, and then lumber following the Civil War. Next slide. Then seafood began to take off. Oysters were sold locally in 1836, and barrels were being shipped north on steamer boats by 1850. By 1896, Appalachia was exporting 50,000 cans of oysters per day, led by the Rouge Brothers Canning Company. Next slide. And then infrastructure, a lot of these pictures are from the Florida Archives. I think you can go online and view these as well. They're pretty cool. But a lot of the infrastructure that you still see on our waterfront is remnants of all of those old shucking houses and canning houses. Next slide. And then in 1913, the Florida Shellfish Commission was organized and shellfish harvesting laws were enacted. In 1933, the Florida Board of Conservation was established and assumed control of statewide shellfish management. Next slide. Since that time, various agencies, such as we used to be under the DNR umbrella and DAX now, but it's been FWC, DEP, they've all been responsible for helping manage the oyster resources and fisheries. From 1999 to 2017, FDAX had an active reshelling program, and we placed substrate or culch in the bay in order to help replenish these reefs. Next slide. So now that we're up to speed on the history, it brings us to current. FWC has enacted a 5-year closure of wild oysters. And as hopefully you learned today, aquaculture will help fulfill that gap and food source, as well as has many environmental benefits. We worked with a stakeholder group in order to establish an aquaculture use zone, or AUZ, for Apalachicola that will help be a sustainable option for Apalachicola Bay. We worked with a stakeholder group in order to help minimize all those conflict uses, as there is a lot of recreational and commercial fisheries still going on as well. And like I said, we don't want to have a lot of different leases all scattered throughout the bay. We kind of wanted to keep them all condensed into one smaller area to be a little bit easier to navigate around. So this is just a general vicinity map to show you where the new aquaculture use zone has been established. We're calling it the 4-mile area, as it's 4 miles from downtown. There's also a little point off to the east known as Green Point. So some people say it's, the Green Point leases. The miles was also historically known for good oysters all throughout the years. Pretty much the whole western arm of Apalachicola Bay is known as the miles. But this just gives you an idea of where it is located within the bay. Next slide. This is a close-up version. So it's 38 parcels, and they're each 1.5 acres apiece. You can see it's pretty nice tucked in back there, has a little bit of protection from storms. It's about 3 to 5 foot depth and a nice sandy mud silt substrate. And it's right off the C30 there. Next slide. These are all going to be water column leases, as I mentioned, and they're all going to be growing oysters currently. But in 2003, NOAA designated 14 areas as critical Gulf sturgeon habitat, and Apalachicola Bay being one of those. So any new leases that go into Apalachicola Bay from that 2003, we're going to have to be water column leases. No more bottom culch leases will be able to go in Apalachicola Bay. Next slide. This is a map showing of all the current and the new leases in Apalachicola Bay. You can see those red areas are our in perpetuity, or our 100-year leases, and they were established before that Gulf sturgeon critical habitat, so they are able to be bottom culched. Then we have 5 new leases over in the 9-mile vicinity. You can see over by that big red block. And then we also have the new AUZ, that little yellow sliver in between those 2 in perpetuity areas. And then we also have two new areas over in the eastern section. We have 5 individual leases over behind the state park known as Rattlesnake Cove, and 1 individual lease off the East Point shoreline up by Highway 65. Next slide. So you might be wondering, as general public, what you can or maybe cannot do in and around these leases. And as I mentioned, they are going to be marked pretty well. You'll be able to see them from the shore or from the water. They have these big, large Coast Guard signs on the outer corners, and also blinking lanterns so you can see them at night. And then it'll also have the smaller PVC poles on the interior corners. Next slide. But the general public is allowed to navigate through those leases, through those easements. It's a 25-foot easement in between each parcel. So you are able to go through and in between those leases and around the edges. Next slide. You also are permitted to fish, swim, or boat in and around the leases. Obviously, these are all going to be water column. So you'll want to try to stick to the easements. There is going to be lines and cages strung throughout the actual parcel, and all of their gear and markers are private property, so any damage to them is illegal. Next slide. Next slide. One more back, I think. And wild shellfish harvest is not permitted within 25 feet and within the lease boundaries. Next slide. And then for the leaseholders, their activities can only be operated on from sunrise to sunset. The use of bottom is prohibited, again, for that Gulf sturgeon critical habitat. Dredges or mechanical harvest devices are prohibited unless specifically authorized by us. And no vessels or platforms can be moored for greater than 24 hours. Next slide. No wild shellfish can be harvested from or relayed to a lease. Culling and sorting of oysters must be done on the lease site. And shellfish products must be sold directly to a certified shellfish processing facility, which we also regulate, as direct to retail sales is prohibited. The farmed oyster may not be sold using a saltwater products license, which is what the wild harvesters use. Next slide. The gear must be securely anchored. All gear must be removed from the water during all mechanical cleaning, as only hand tools can be used on the water. During harvest, gear must be rinsed and cleaned over the grow out area. Next slide. And all materials must be clean and free of pollutants. Any petroleum-based products such as tars, oils, and greases or other pollutants are prohibited. And then compounds used as preservatives must be used in accordance with the product label. Next slide. The leaseholder's identification information must be attached to all floating or off-bottom culturing structures. Usually they're in this orange or yellow, nice and bright. You'll be able to see them. And usually they have their phone and number, or phone and name on there. Next slide. And so if you ever are walking the shoreline and happen to come across anything that looks like this aquaculture gear, look for those tags. Obviously, the leaseholder will want to tag that gear, as that gear can get pretty expensive. So they're also responsible for retrieving that and disposing if needed. And also they want to retrieve that gear back in case they can reuse it, and including when dislodged during a storm event. We also go out during major storm events and do shoreline surveys to ensure that there's not a whole lot of gear scattered about. And the leaseholder must also remove all structures within 60 days if they decide to terminate the lease. And I believe that's all I have.
Okay, questions. Let's see. I know we had some come in. And also, Kennedy added a link in the question and answer box where you can find out about our upcoming Sci-Cafes.
Yeah, it's actually in the chat box and not the question, just so you're looking in the right place.
Oh. Thank you. Georgia asked, I see. I'm having trouble viewing it. Okay, this question's from Georgia, and she wants to know, what role does FDACS have in pertaining to adjacent infrastructure to the AUZs, i.e. parking lots, bathrooms, etc.?
So she's referring to like on land, I guess. So the like Leonard's Landing down in Franklin County at the Alligator Harbor site, maybe.
Yeah, I think she's just saying, you know, where. Yeah, she said yes on land. Yes, Leonard's Landing.
Yeah, we don't have any.
Oh, that's David Adlerson. Sorry.
Ownership on that, no.
Okay, so I think the question he's getting at is there anything that DAX does to provide for that? I know the county's had questions about that, trying to get the infrastructure on land to serve what's going on in the water. And
There is a current kiosk, I believe, at the Leonard's Landing, and we've been working with DEP and other agencies to get some informational kiosks and stuff up like that at Leonard's Landing as well.
okay. Sorry, I'm having trouble viewing the questions. Kenny, can you see the questions?
Here, I'm having some luck. Let's see. Chad
for it.
Hansen asked, are most oyster farmers raising triploids in the bay, or what's the balance and trend, if any?
Yeah, most of them I would say are growing triploids. They do have to, like I said, submit for audit. So I haven't seen this year's crop yet of what is being submitted. But to my knowledge, the majority that I've heard is the triploids.
Okay, great. And then I have another from David Adlerstein. What future growth do you foresee in the next 5 years?
Well, aquaculture is growing rapidly, so we hope, yes, it's going to be lots of growth. It's hard to say in 5 years. Like I said, we're trying to get permitted for seaweed in the state of Florida, and the technology is just constantly growing. So, yeah, I foresee aquaculture really growing over the next 5 years.
And do you see lease permitting increasing as well, and if at any rate that you could say?
Yeah, it's hard to say a rate. It just depends on the availability and the public interest.
Great, thank you. Okay, we got one from Candace Mixon. How long does it take for an oyster to grow to the desired 2.5-inch size?
Well, it really depends on the environmental conditions. Back in Chesapeake Bay, where I grew up, the old adage was an inch a year. But with our conditions, I've heard that we can grow a 3-inch oyster in 18 months or less. Obviously, these guys are growing it from seed, from a little bit, starting out with a little bit of growth. So it could take anything from a year to a year and a half to get that 2.5 or 3-inch oyster.
We got one more from David. Do you help obtain funding, give them advice on where to go if they want to enter the aquaculture business?
We do help people. We've been doing a lot of work, especially over COVID pandemic, to try to work with these guys on try to see what they can apply for in grants and stuff. But once you've applied, our fees are really minimal when it comes to applying for the actual aquaculture lease. And then it's up to the harvester or the leaseholder to then provide their economics for the rest of the lease.
You can only see.
Okay.
Great. We have one from Ethan. Are upwellers allowed for grow out?
You do have to get some upwellers approved. Usually they're land-based.
It's looking like all we have right now.
Okay.
And then Kennedy asked a question that I can answer. He asked, where would one go to get more information about events like these? And that would be Appalachicoreserve.com/events. There's a link for it in the chat box if you're interested in attending other of our upcoming Sci-Cafes.
Great, thank you. Yes, I wanted to thank Carrie so much. We really enjoyed your presentation, and also thank Kennedy and Josh for being the tech whizzes. We're all still learning. I did want to invite you, the Sci-Cafe will be the 4th Thursday of every month. We have one coming up. The next one coming up will be February 25th. Our guest speaker will be Sandra Brook. She is the project lead of the Apalachicola Bay Systems Initiative, which is the effort to restore oysters in the bay. And and find out what caused it to crash. So we invite you to register for that webinar. The webinar after that is we'll have Jeff Beal with Ducks Unlimited is going to talk about the MK Ranch restoration. That was a shrimp farm done years ago up near Lake Wemico, really on the Apalachicola River. And then we'll have an April webinar, which will be discussing the oyster core, and that's part of the conservation core. They're going to be starting a shell restoration program and some monitoring programs for our youth, and that hopefully that will keep our shells, whether they be grown in aquaculture or harvested naturally somewhere, they'll keep them out of the landfill and make them useful, maybe for shoreline protection. So once again, thank you, Carrie. We really appreciate your presentation, and thanks everybody for attending our meeting.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay.